After Donald Trump was found in contempt for violating his gag order a staggering 10th time, it looks like the former president and current criminal defendant has officially run out of rope. Judge Wagner told his attorneys in court, quote, "It appears that the $1,000 fines are not serving as a deterrent. The last thing I want to do is put you in jail. You are the former president of the United States and possibly the next president as well. There are many reasons why incarceration is truly a last resort for me, but at the end of the day, I have a job to do. So as much as I do not want to impose a jail sanction, and I have done everything I can to avoid doing so, I want you to understand that I will if necessary and appropriate."
We are awaiting a decision from Judge Wagner, and he kind of took us through some major moments early this morning, talking about the gravity of a situation, the fact that it would also involve Secret Service if he were to be put in jail, if he were to violate this gag order. Although he is not putting him in jail for now, it seems to be yet another threat for the former president to not continue to violate this gag order. It seems like the judge is ready, willing, and prepared to put the former president in jail if he continues to violate the gag order. But again, understanding the gravity of that situation and really what it would go into in making that decision.
And so that's the line in the sand drawn by Judge Maran. What remains to be seen is what happens not if, but when Trump violates his gag order again. Judge Maran will be put in the position where he'll either have to abide by the conditions that he himself set forth, or he'll continue giving Donald Trump wide latitude to violate his orders, which will effectively tell Trump that he won't be subject to the rules of the court and he can do whatever he wants. Basically, that he's above the law. Hopefully, Judge Maran understands the implications of his next move in that scenario. And sadly, even the fact that Judge Maran opted to treat Trump's 10th violation with another slap on the wrist is evidence to some folks that, in fact, this judge isn't up to the task of holding Trump to account in the same manner as any other criminal defendant. To that point, here's MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner outlining his waning faith in Trump being held properly accountable, and he actually uses one of Judge Maran's own statements to prove his theory.
Today was the 10th count of criminal contempt of court that Judge Maran found Donald Trump guilty of beyond a reasonable doubt. And yet, what did he say? He said, well, another $1,000 fine. What we now know, Brian, is there has been no appreciable punishment or sanction for Donald Trump's first 10 violations of Judge Maran's order not to talk about and endanger witnesses, jurors, and others. Now, once again, Judge Maran gave him a stern warning, do it again, do it for an 11th time, and you might see the inside of a jail cell. But there's something that Judge Maran said that was infuriating to me. And let me read it so I don't misquote it. I know exactly
what you're going to say.
This is upsetting. He said, the last thing I want to do, he is saying to Donald Trump, is to put you in jail. You are the former president of the United States and possibly the next president as well. What did Judge Maran convey? And I have been very supportive of Judge Maran in the way he has presided over this trial, but you got to call it out when you see him doing wrong. What he said was, in substance, if you were any other Huck, any other defendant, anybody who did not have power, privilege, status, wealth, position, you'd be in jail, right? For 10 counts of contempt of court, you'd be in jail. But I don't want to do that to you. Why? Because you're the former president and you might very well be president again. That is offensive to the equal application of the rule of law. And it, made me a little bit nauseous when I read it.
In other words, Judge Maran has made it clear that he is doing everything in his power not to incarcerate Trump. And if it wasn't already blatantly obvious by his actions, or lack thereof, it's now even more obvious by his words. But with that said, despite Judge Maran lobbying for Trump's freedom, Trump himself very clearly seems not to want to test the limits of his gag order any further. Sure, he'll say stuff like this.
And frankly, you know what? Our Constitution is much more important than jail. It's not even close. I'll do that sacrifice any day.
Donald Trump proclaims himself ready to do that personal sacrifice any day. And I want to be clear with you, legally and otherwise, both in the context of this trial and just him running for president right now, he has every right to talk that way, to describe himself how he wants. But as for the claim there, I can tell you factually, Donald Trump has rarely taken personal legal sacrifices, and the many different cases and probes that have ensnared him and others, he often lets even his former close aides get in trouble, get subpoenaed, pay big legal bills, or even go to jail, and he's generally sat out those big fights. We covered one with his former aide, Peter Navarro, where for months Donald Trump wouldn't even sign a piece of paper affirming Navarro's defense that he had invoked a type of privilege which didn't apply, but whether he tried to invoke it for Navarro. My point being that was not much of a sacrifice, and he didn't do that.
He'll romanticize this idea that he's the next Nelson Mandela and that he'll gladly get locked up to protect the Constitution or whatever other nonsense he's telling himself. But I believe that the guy realizes what the reality of him sitting in a jail cell would be. Sure, he could rile up his base who's already voting for him. Sure, he could squeeze in for some money. Sure, he'll get Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Judge Jeanine to dial up the faux outrage and pretend that their God King is even more of a victim, if that was even possible. But think about the implications on the broader electorate. You think that's really going to help Trump with those independent voters and suburban moms and pro-democracy Republicans out there to see this guy languishing in a jail cell? You think that's going to make them want to vote for the guy more? You think that's a smart campaign move to end up in jail? And I'm not talking about Donald Trump's base. Those people are already on board. I'm talking about the people who are actually up for grabs, who Trump needs if he wants to win the election. And the lasting image that they would have before they go into a voting booth is that this guy was just in a prison cell. I don't exactly think that's going to help him. And I think Donald Trump knows that. For as little self-control as this guy seems to have, even he can recognize the damage that him sitting in a jail cell would have on the broader electorate. And while he may be able to grift his supporters for some more cash and ramp up the victimhood to a 10, if he wants to get elected in November, he probably knows that staying out of jail is the better option here. Consider, too, if he wanted to be jailed, he could have very easily already done it. He could very easily attack Michael Cohen or Stormy Daniels. Instead, he actually is attempting, albeit clumsily, to exercise some restraint. Here's what that awkward effort looks like.
And it's a disgrace. And then you have the other thing that maybe is even more disgraceful is the gag order, where I can't basically, I have to watch every word I tell you people. You ask me a question, a simple question, I'd like to give it, but I can't talk about it. Because this judge has given me a gag order and said you'll go to jail if you violate it.
Again, if he wanted to be locked up, he wouldn't whine about his gag order. He would simply cross the red line and violate it once more.
They were talking about how he might end up in jail if he continues to violate his court orders. Is Rikers prepared for that?
Our amazing commissioner, she is prepared for whatever comes on Rikers Island. We don't want to deal with a hypothetical, but they're professionals. They'll be ready.
Frankly, I think at this point Trump is contending with a pretty crushing realization. He looks weak. He wants his supporters to believe that he's in charge, that he's tough, that no one can stop him from saying what he wants to say or doing what he wants to do. But in reality, this trial is exposing the fact that he is very much not in charge. He is at the mercy of a justice system that, at least theoretically, shouldn't care who's sitting in the defendant's chair. And so Trump's air of invincibility that he relies on to dupe his fans is withering away in real time. Instead, the guy looks weak. And for a self-proclaimed strongman, there is nothing worse. He is stuck in a courtroom, whining about how cold it is, falling asleep, begging for days off, having temper tantrums in the hallway. Donald Trump is the image of weakness. And I bet that even he knows that the only way for him to look even weaker than he already does right now is if he was stuck in a jail cell. He'll pretend that it's some badge of honor, sure, but he will look like a pathetic, desperate criminal, even more so than he does right now. Before you go, to see more content from MSNBC, make sure to subscribe to this channel by clicking the link right here on this screen. And you can also follow the link to see some exclusive content only on TikTok.